Thank you. Great. We have about it's until 12:15 for questions, comments, and awesomeness.
I really like these papers. My question is about nostalgia and escapism. And one of the things I'm thinking of with, which is, it's because we're talking about TV, there's a lovely collection called In the Blue Light of the TV Screen, I think it is, by Claire Cronin, which is looking at images of us streaming TV shows as a form, and horror films particularly, as a form of, how we sit with depression. And I think of so many different horror films which just thematize the image of us sitting there just consuming. And so I was thinking of that with the idea of food and thinking about like images in horror films that reflect upon our bodies while we're watching and what it means for like when maybe us are eating that junk food. And so I guess the question, which also might be about Stranger Things in a different kind of way, is about that relationship between, whether or not we're eating foods that are participating in that sort of climate collapse in terms of all the packaging and stuff like that. What is the relationship between that longing to go back to a world, while we're watching it decline in the present, you know what I mean? And the idea of like actually working towards something. In the case of Stranger Things, I even think of like the Coca-Cola, like the way it's like so, but like how does a show like that, which is catering to nostalgia, also critiquing that past?
Well, I think in zombie films...
Use the microphone.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I think in zombie films, Michael Newbury definitely says it's, a judgment on the present,
You can take it out if you want.
Okay. I'll just leave it. The present, unsustainable agriculture, and unhealthy eating. So for him, I think he definitely sees it as something that is a critical judgment of the present. But the more I watched, the more I felt that, and maybe it was just a paradox, or maybe it was the distance of time between the apocalypse and when the food was still good, but it seemed to not matter. And I know that sounds terrible, but it just didn't matter. It was in packaging, it was chemical compounds, it was high fat and high salt, and it was like, who cares? It just tasted good and it made people feel better. And how long are we going to live in an apocalypse anyway? Enjoy yourself. Take your moments.
Okay. Yes, Allison.
Thank you, all three panelists. My question is for you, Dr. Bosstick. I want to use that term because I know you're a newly minted professor.
Listen, I love that. Thank you.
So I was really, I don't know at all Delicious Dungeons or Delicious in the Dungeon, but I was intrigued by the character of Fallon. Fallon. So if I am repeating this correctly, the other characters have to consume the dragon bits in order for the human to be released. So my first thought was this is a sort of exorcism, right? This eviction of the monstrous through consumption. But then I started to think it sounds a little bit like a soul eater, but the inverted form of a soul eater. So could you say more about that and whether or not I'm on the right track?
Yeah, I think especially like, because whenever you say solar, I also think of like sin eaters too, the whole notion from like New England where people would show up, eat food, and take little bits of the dead person's sin with them so they can go to heaven. So I think like that plus the exorcism is kind of a key visual element here. Like, I have not had a chance yet to read the manga that this anime is based on. I believe the manga has been completed. Without knowing anything about the ending of that. So for those of you out there who have read it, don't spoil it for me. Like, my biggest assumption is that the anime series is going to end with like everyone that has interacted with the Totem Party literally sitting at like a giant table eating Fallon. So like there are these ritualistic components of and the like social elements of freeing Fallon's human side from her dragon side. So it requires that like coming together of people and performing that act of eating to remove. So yeah, I definitely think like that soul eater, sin eater, exorcism element is at play with that character and how she will eventually, could eventually be freed from that dragon element.
Thanks, Harold. Okay, I see another hand over here.
Excellent work, everyone. That was fascinating. Great work. I love Cheetos and I love Delicious in Dungeons. So great. But my question is for Rico, right?
Yeah.
So when you brought up Heart of Darkness, it reminded me of when I would use that as a paired text with Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. And you mentioned a lot about this infiltration of the mind. One of the characters in Things Fall Apart is the son of the protagonist. His name is Nwoye, and he willingly joins the European missionaries and converts to Christianity.
What's the name of the book again? I'm sorry.
Things Fall Apart. Sorry, I might not have even said that. Things Fall Apart.
Things Fall Apart. Okay, I see.
Yes.
Okay.
And but my question, and more like a request, really, can you speak to that version of the infiltration of the mind, where someone, it seems, willingly joins their oppressor, right? And
Yeah, well, so, I mean, I kind of talked about that a little bit with the hive mind mentality, but, like, the idea of, like, blindly joining an oppressor without even necessarily knowing it, and, like, the consequences of that, that's something that we see with, like I talked about with the hive mind, and then kind of within colonial frameworks, we have, like, the Wetiko with Jack Forbes, and we have this kind of inherent desire sometimes to join power and to join somebody who's oppressing us, and we don't always realize that that's happening until maybe later in the relationship. You know, of course, we see that in many different forms. We see that in relationships and everything. So I guess that's my answer to that. So, yeah. Thank you.
Kala.
I'm sorry, Dr. Bosstick. Another question from someone who hasn't watched Delicious in Dungeon.
Excellent.
I was really fascinated by this mention that one of the characters was cognizant of the fact that there maybe had been inter-dwarf cannibalism, and that was something that they were afraid of. I'm wondering, outside of the survival context of the dungeon, what does personhood and eating and exo and endogamous cannibalism look like in this broader world before they had entered that, and how are people in this world usually conceptualizing of the personhood of monsters?
Excellent. Thank you so much. That's a great question. And to be honest, the larger world of Delicious in Dungeon, the kingdom that it's actually located in, and the wider world, it seems as though cannibalism is thought of very similar to how we in the real world do. It is one of the greatest taboos anybody could commit, even in that survival circumstance. So, I think that's a big part of the reason that Senshi has so much trauma surrounding food, is because he doesn't know if he has committed that violation of the taboo yet or not. So he's constantly in that state of not knowing whether or not he has done the unthinkable, or if he remains unaffected by that potentiality. As for the personhood of monsters, a lot of people, and this is kind of seen with Chilchuck, Marcel, and other characters like them in the series, where monsters are monsters. They may look like humans. For instance, I mentioned that there were the mammalian merfolk and the fish merfolk. The mammalians literally are like the naked-chested women with the fish tails and the hair. The premise is that these are actual creatures created by the dungeon themselves. So even though they appear to be human in form, they are not. That's one thing that this dungeon has created, is stuff that looks like human but is not human. However, that doesn't mean that they're free from the stigma of looking like humans. So that's where some of this negotiation takes place between the members of this adventuring party, is that I don't care if this is technically a monster and is not human. It looks like a human. I don't want to eat it. So while these monsters are kind of generally known as non-human and are accepted as non-human, the perceptions of the human is still placed upon them.
Awesome. Other questions, thoughts, fatal riddles? I see a hand over there. Great. Sam.
Thank you all for these. These were really, really interesting papers. I also have a question for Rico, just thinking about thinking about another kind of intertext for Stranger Things and The Shining, and this sort of indigenous burial ground as a trope of American horror, and this way of kind of thinking or not thinking about kind of America's original sins of colonization and imperialism through that space. And I mean, you it's been a while since I've watched Stranger Things. You've engaged with it much more than I have. To my mind, that's not really dealt with. Like there isn't. I can't think of any sort of direct indigenous presence in Stranger Things or any way of grappling with the fact that it's in Indiana. Like with the history of that place. And so I'm just wondering kind of how you read that. And I thought your paper was really interesting in reading kind of around that and reading the settler colonial logics in that show. But I'd be very curious for perspectives on the kind of absence of indigeneity in that work and and how you respond to that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that's kind of something that is very prevalent in a lot of like modern sci-fi where we don't necessarily have like explicit indigenous presence, but there's a lot of kind of external metaphors that can be seen. And like what I talked about with, the influence of Joseph Conrad, influence of H.P. Lovecraft, these people that do come from these kind of colonial analytical backgrounds, those are still very present, I think, indirectly. And if we know how to kind of think about that and analyze it, then we can see those connections, even if maybe there aren't actually indigenous people in the show. And that is, one thing that like with 11, it's interesting. I made that connection with my relationship with indigeneity and my kind of relationship to that reality. And I saw how 11's treated as kind of an echo of that. So I was able to kind of, come at it from my relationship with the show just through my own life. But yeah, thank you.
Others? Final thoughts? You want to go again, Brendan? Yeah, I think everyone.
Thank you. My question is for Dr. Bosstick. The first thing I was thinking about was in terms of the creatures that look like humanoid in some different form is like the evolutionary logics of creatures that evolve to look like they have faces on their backs or something like that, so predators won't eat them. And so I'm just really curious in thinking a little bit about the logic of what it means to think of the dungeon as sort of curating these experiences. And the second quick question is just in terms of if any of this research overlaps with video games. I don't play Zelda, but things like cooking monsters in games.
Yeah, there actually are a number of conversations that the characters in Dungeon Meshi, Dungeon Meshi is another name for it, and sometimes that slips out of my mouth instead of Delicious and Dungeon. But in the second episode, one of the things the party encounters are those man-eating plants. And they talk about how that particular species interacts with the ecology of that level of the dungeon. Particularly that while the plant itself eats creatures, it also produces like fruits of different flavors to attract different things to come close to it. So they talk about like the ecological hierarchies and development of the various pieces in the dungeon that work together. Another example is something called the baromets that looks like a sheep or a goat, but is actually a plant, but it tastes like meat and it draws in other like meat eaters, carnivores in the area to like disperse its seeds through like the normal eating and pollination type stuff. So that is a component that is often addressed within the narrative of the anime where they talk about the delicate balance between the ecology and the adventurers interacting with those spaces. In terms of video games, I can definitely see like the Zelda element. I'm more of a tabletop RPG player, and one of the things like most recently that I've encountered is if any of you have ever heard of the Daggerheart system that was recently released by Critical Role.
We've heard of it.
Okay, cool, excellent. Their new core book released like these campaign themes, one of which was based on Delicious and Dungeon, and there's these whole mechanical elements of like what this particular flavor does for the character, what happens when these flavors interact with one another. So again, not necessarily video games, but like game mechanics in general. I thought that was very interesting, seeing that come out. But yeah.
I'm just waiting for Sami Nusrat to write a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. That would be freaking awesome. Final thought? Anybody? Okay, yeah. I'm coming. Thank you.
First of all, thank you all. That was all really interesting stuff. My question or thought is more directed at Shannon and the food, which was setting off all kinds of things in my head as you were talking. Suddenly, films, post-apocalyptic scenes that suddenly make a great deal of sense. This is Zombieland. The one character's obsession with finding Twinkies. It's basically this defining character aspect. But I was thinking more broadly about how food is presented in these things, and it's often, it occurs to me, like the high point of these films. The shopping scene in 28 Days Later, or going back further, the Dawn of the Dead movies, when there's kind of wallowing in consumerism, or interestingly, the Road, Cormac McCarthy's, where they find a bunker and they're just going nuts with the canned goods there. And The Road, it struck me as interesting because that's kind of the high point, I think. It's been a while since I've read it, but that's like the happiest moment for them. And what seems, in my recollection, is the darkest moment, perhaps, is when they find the alternative food in the house's basement. So it's like food is on either end of the sort of extreme directions here. So I just, not really a question, just a thought I have. Thanks.
No, that's a really good thought. You said you weren't going to heckle me, and I guess that's not a heckle. No, I really like that. It is the high point, I think, of a lot of these films, and the dwindling supplies, or things that have gone bad, or can be the low point. But I started noticing that was, if there was any joy in an apocalyptic film, it happened with a Pop-Tart or a bag of Cheetos or Twinkies, or just something. And of course, things were going to crash immediately upon that euphoria. But it was really true. And then the more I read about food nostalgia, it really does do that in our brains so effectively. And even approximation, which is when I'm stressed out traveling and presenting, I eat M&Ms, and this is the closest I could come, which is actually says bite-sized candy-coated milk chocolate candies, which I think is the exact description of what an M&M is. But I mean, they're not a crunchy coating, is not as crunchy, and the color isn't quite there, but it's good enough. It's enough to calm me down enough to get the paper read. So I feel like we do go back into those happier places, and we can do it in groups. And food brings people together now too. It's just that it's crappier food choices usually by then. So whatever you can do, that's how it works. I don't think that's a very good answer, but that's all I got.
Thanks, Shannon. Okay, well, with that said, we can now move on to actually eating. So, a big hand, please, for our panel.